recently elected. She was recently elected to represent District 2 in Sunnyvale City Council, and she is both the first Latina and first openly LGBTQ person ever elected to that position. This year, she was also elected to be a delegate representing Assembly District 24 in the California Democratic Party. And her goal is to use whatever tools she has to advocate for vibrant, resilient, diverse communities that we all will benefit from, whether she's serving an elected office as your representative on the city council or as your representative on the California State Democratic Party. So why don't I let Councilmember Cisneros speak about Pride Month.
Thank you so much, Linda, for that really kind introduction. And I need everyone to forgive my voice. It sounds like I went to a rock concert, but it's my allergies. So I will do my best and hopefully you can understand me. But what I wanted to say is that Pride is more than a celebration. It's a remembrance of where an entire community came from. Statistically, 1 in 6 people identify somewhere on the spectrum of LGBTQ. This is an incredible amount of people who come in as many diverse areas as the rainbow itself, more than it can encapsulate. And when I decided to run for office, I knew I would be the first, but I also knew as I was growing up, I'd been working in politics and public policy for about 10 years, that there were very few people who looked like me that I could emulate and see myself in. And my goal is to be that person for somebody else. We always say Pride, the first Pride was a riot. And by riot, we mean a true riot, a true rising up. And that's what Pride started out as. It was a way for people to reject the kind of bigotry and the discrimination and the very fear for people's lives by being out in the streets and being themselves. And that is a tradition we carry on today. It is a wonderful celebration, but as we celebrate, we have to remember the people who aren't celebrating with us now. It's an important time to have in reflection through all aspects of our world. And ultimately, for me, when I think about what Pride means, it's a celebration of my everyday life. It's my ability to do my laundry, go grocery shopping, have a family, be part of a community, have friends, be open with my family and loved and accepted by them, and just living a life that so many people take for granted. It's the little things that make up progress. And Pride represents those little things that come together to make up progress. And for each person who finds themselves in a situation where they're either in leadership or they're just coming out, that is bravery. And I know so many fantastic allies, many of them in this room. And when there are anti-trans bills proliferating throughout our country, I know that you are the people that the community can count on to stand up. Just because we live in California doesn't mean that we can rest on our laurels and just assume that we are a safe place. We have seen the murders of trans women just recently in our communities, and people are still at risk. We have to take this extremely seriously, and at the same time, not too seriously. We have to remember to have that celebration aspect that itself is revolution. I believe it was Emma Goldman that said, if I can't dance in the revolution. I don't want to be a part of it. Something to that effect. And that's what we do during Pride. I am very honored to be the first, and I know that I'm going to be far from the last. Seeing the next generation of openly LGBTQ people coming up and recognizing their power is something that keeps me going and makes me feel stronger as both an elected official and as a community leader, knowing that our future is bright, colorful, and ready to become the norm rather than an aberration. So I wanted to thank this club. I want to thank the city of Sunnyvale for having this opportunity to formally recognize Pride, even in my own district. It was extremely meaningful. And knowing that when it comes down to it, we're ready to take on this fight. So thank you all from the bottom of my heart for opening your hearts to me and putting your confidence in me, and for putting your confidence in the next generation of LGBTQ people coming up to represent not just their community, but the people around them. So thank you very much. And of course, I wanted to always plug my doors open to you. When we're thinking about the next generation, you first have to ask them to run. It took probably 10 times asking me to run before I did it. So find somebody who you recognize as a leader, perhaps they're of the LGBTQ community, and be that person to tell them to run, maybe not for city council, but for a commission. And that's going to be how you make the difference in pulling forth this future that we are creating better than the last every single day. So thank you again. I look forward to a wonderful meeting with all of you. And again, thanks for putting up with my frog throat. Wish it was from a rock concert, but happy meeting, and just thank you.
Thank you so much, Councilmember Cisneros. So next we'll have Raven Malone. So Raven is a system engineer and a delegate for the California Democratic Party. In the recent election, she was the third highest vote getter in our assembly district from like over 40 candidates for our Democratic Party delegate elections for the California Democratic Party. Seeing the way things are headed in politics and social justice encouraged her to run for city council in Palo Alto in 2020. While she lost her election, she is committed to bringing important issues to the table, lifting up voices of those who feel unheard. She advocates for equality, social justice, healthcare for all, ending homelessness, mental health, and among many other important issues that we're facing today. So we'll let Raven Malone start off our talk about Juneteenth. So Jason, do you want to spotlight Raven?
Should I wait or do I start? Oh,
yeah,
okay.
Go ahead.
Okay.
The floor is yours.
Well, hi. I'm sorry, my hair is doing this weird thing and my eye keeps watering. So if you guys see me keep doing things, let's just ignore it. I am also struggling with allergies today, like Alyssa. So just bear with me. But hi, happy Pride, everyone. And I mean, today, happy Juneteenth. I'm so excited. I'm so happy that it was finally made a federal holiday. This is something that's long overdue. I'm very disappointed in the, 19 Republicans that voted against it for their own various reasons. But now we get to celebrate, and now it is a federal holiday, which, given the debate over critical race theory, we'll see how that goes in schools. But thank you for joining us. Thank you for being here today. Thank you, Linda, for inviting me and the Democratic Party, the Sunnyvale Democratic Party. I'm very happy to be here. So Black people have spent generations fighting for rights. First, it was the right to be free, because we were brought here involuntarily, even though that some people try to debate that. And ever since then, it's kind of been this fight for equity. Okay, so why is Juneteenth important? I'm sure that not everyone here knows too much about Juneteenth, given it's not talked about or taught in some areas, including where I'm from in Alabama. It's not really talked about. As a matter of fact, a lot of Black history has had to be learned from us doing our own independent studies. So Juneteenth is the celebration of the freeing of slaves in Confederate states. It originally took place after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed by Lincoln, which was January 1st, 1863. But all slaves didn't know that they were free until 2 years later. So 2 years later, on Juneteenth, the slaves that lived in Texas learned that they were free, and thus Juneteenth. So this is the celebration of when all men were free. So in history, we learn about Christopher Columbus and how he discovered America, even though that's not really what happened. We all know that, right? But yet we still celebrate Christopher Columbus in our history. We still celebrate the Confederacy in our history. Even though they lost, I grew up in Alabama, I would see Confederate flags everywhere. Even still, Confederate flags everywhere. Statues of Confederate soldiers everywhere. And it's almost like it's kind of a symbol to me as a Black person. It is a symbol of, you know, this is where you should have been, even though you're free now. Like, this isn't what we wanted. And there are people who argue that the Civil War wasn't over slaves, it was over states' rights. But it was over the states' rights of what? It was over the states' rights to own slaves. So let's not let anyone sugarcoat it. That is what the war was over. So I'm going back and forth. I took a lot of notes of what I wanted to talk about today, and I know that I only have 10 or 15 minutes, so I'm watching the time to make sure that I don't go over. But this is something that I'm really passionate about because it upsets me of how much of our history we don't know, and how that contributes to the equity of Black people in America. So you don't really know about the history, you don't really know about Juneteenth, or even, I'll say, the real history, because a lot of what our history is very whitewashed. As a matter of fact, I mean, there are people who are today fighting against critical race theory. There are people who have created PACs, so funded organizations, to fight against having critical race theory taught in schools, which critical race theory is basically the teachings of the system that is systematic racism, how it came to be, how we can work together to dismantle it, which if Black people ever can become, I guess, equitable citizens of the United States, that's what would have to happen. We would have to teach critical race theory so that people know what exactly needs to be fixed, how these problems came to be, and how to dismantle them. So also there are people who are, so as far as Black people, we're fighting against, so not only are we fighting over the right to a fair education, or even our fair education of learning our own history. We're also fighting against mass incarceration. At the same time, we're fighting for the right to not be killed at the hands of the police. We're fighting against discriminatory housing policies. We're fighting against discriminatory zoning laws, which is a big thing here in the Bay Area, racial profiling, lack of generational wealth, etc. The list goes on. But at the end of the day, just like every other culture has the right to learn about their history. We do too, and we don't deserve to have that stripped away from us. So that's why I'm very excited that Juneteenth is now a federal holiday, because Juneteenth is putting Black people at the center of the celebration. I mean, Black people, we participate in celebrations of people and institutions that were not and are not still for us. So now that Juneteenth is a holiday, we can celebrate in a way where Black people are at the center, and where we can teach history, our history, the way that it should be taught. And I know that some of you are probably thinking, okay, well, there's a whole month for that, right? There's February, there's Black History Month, but Black History Month is very whitewashed. And as a matter of fact, I'll give you an example. Okay, so let me see if I can see you all. Okay, so there's a reactions at the bottom of your screen, and I would really love it if you guys could use it. So a show of hands, I want you to raise your hand, raise your virtual reactions hand like this. Do you see on my screen? Okay, so I want you to do that if you have ever heard of Seneca Village. Seneca Village, anyone? Okay, so I've seen one person. Okay, so how many of you have heard of Central Park? Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of hands. We're almost unanimous. They're the same thing. So Seneca Village was a village of minorities in New York, and it was bulldozed. So there was a minority community, there were banks and stores, and it was thriving, and there was wealth that could be passed down from generations. And that's important because we're going to talk about how there's a history of that, because we're talking about the equity of Black people. So, and I'm wiping my eyes, my eyes are watering. I was outside and I shouldn't have been. Please excuse me. My body is like, what is outside? Okay, so Seneca Village was a up and thriving Black neighborhood. Well, I don't want to say Black neighborhood. There were more ethnicities there than just Black. But minority culture, that was the area, and it took up the whole area that is now Central Park, which if you've ever been to New York and if you've been to Central Park, it is just about impossible to go through the whole thing in a day because it's so big. It's almost like its own city, which it was. And now that I know that, every time I go to New York, that is what I think about. I think about how this beautiful piece of land was stripped from people of color just because. And they did it by charging them rent that they couldn't afford and then evicting them. And the people who could find ways to afford their rent when they were raised to rates that were hardly affordable for any of the people of color who lived there, they found ways to evict them anyway. And then they bulldozed the whole neighborhood and they replaced it with a park. So they evicted these Black and brown and indigenous people who were thriving and living like that. That's like someone taking, I'll say Palo Alto because I live here. So we have all of these neighborhoods and you know, we're creating new technologies every day. And then if someone just said, you know, we're going to keep raising your rent until you can't afford to live here, which I feel like that's what's happening now. But then not only that, the people who are left over, we're going to evict you anyway. And then we're going to create a park for people to live. Like, you can't live here, but we're going to build trees and stuff to be here instead because we want them more. Okay. So how many of you have heard of the move bombing? Just raise your hand. Okay. Martin, you're on it. Steve, I know you know about this.
I used to live near Philadelphia.
That does not shock me at all that Steve knows this. Okay. All right. So not many. Okay. So the move bombing was a bombing of a neighborhood that happened in 1985. So this was recent. And when we talk about Black history and kind of the way that things developed to get to where they are today. Oh, Leah watched it on live TV. Whoa, okay. So basically this was the police bombing an area because they wanted to get activists out of some buildings. So they bombed a building. Have any of you ever heard of that? They bombed a building with people in it. I've never heard of such a thing happening in my day. And I mean, I say that like I'm so old, but I've never seen something like that happening. Even though we've had these mass shootings, I've seen standoffs, all these things, and no one said, hey, let's just bomb them. Who cares about getting them out? Just bomb the whole thing. So they were so Leah's giving you guys some background information in the chat, as well as, oh, yes, Bruce's Beach. So there's some helpful information in the chat that people are dropping. Thank you guys. But people talk about Black history and, you know, segregation and all of the violent acts have been done towards Black people like this was very old news. But this was a bombing that happened in Philadelphia in 1985. That's not very old news to me. And it's like the United States has been historically constantly at a war against Black people, and it has not stopped yet. And no one's doing anything about it. So not only we come here as slaves, we become freed finally, but then what do? They don't hire us for jobs. They change healthcare. How many of you knew that privatized healthcare is racist? Yes, I'm gonna get to the Tulsa massacre. Well, yes and no. I have limited amount of time. I could literally teach a class on this, but okay. So now Black people need healthcare, right? We need to go to the dentist. We need to get checked up. We're catching colds, but doctors don't want to see us. So what do? They say, all right, so you can see the doctor, but it has to be done through your job. That's the only way that you can get health care. You can see the doctors through your job. And that's it. So now they solved that problem. So now Black people can't get jobs and we can't get health care. So that's why historically Black people did a lot of hard labor jobs, which some Black people still do, kind of frontline work. So let me go back to my notes because I feel like I'm getting a little off topic. And Linda, please let me know when I'm running short of time because I forgot what time I started. Sorry. But so now we're trying to buy homes and now we're dealing with redlining. And even just recently, there was a Black couple who was selling their home and they got their home appraised. Have any of you seen that? They got their home appraised and then they had a white person stand in and got their home appraised again. And it got appraised at a much higher rate than it did when the Black couple was shown as the homeowners. And these things still happen today. As a matter of fact, I live in Palo Alto, and when I moved here, and my fiance, he was talking about this earlier today, when we tell people that we live in Palo Alto, people go, oh, you live in East Palo Alto? Okay. And I'm like, no, I live in Palo Alto. But there are all of these policies that contribute to racism. So then they get rid of slavery, but then they find a legal way to do it through the policing system. So now there's legal slavery, which is why a lot of Black people say we're free-ish. So now there's legal slavery through the privatized prison system. So now, then there was stop and frisk, which we all know who was stopped and frisked in the streets. It certainly wasn't people who are ideal Palo Altans, I guess, as people feel like Black people live in East Palo Alto. But that's kind of the reality for Black people. So we're being denied home loans. It's hard to get home loans. Even still, Black people have a hard time getting home loans. Even still, Black people have a hard time, even when it comes to going to the doctor and telling them that we have pain. There have been studies done that doctors and nurses still believe that say that Black people have a higher pain tolerance, which isn't true. And there are doctors and nurses in the medical field today who still believe this. And I just realized that my background is all funky. I'm sorry. Why? All right, there. All right, I fixed it. All right, so there are a lot of reasons that there's a dire need for equity in America, especially for Black people, because then there was the bombing of Black Wall Street, and there was a lot of wealth. There was a lot of generational wealth to be passed down that was in Black Wall Street. And none of that was given back. As a matter of fact, there were no reparations for slavery, but you know who did get reparations? The slave owners. The United States paid slave owners who had to free their slaves because they lost property. But the Black people who were slaves were denied that. They weren't given any money. Even still, when people talk about reparations, there's a lot of, oh, but I didn't do that. I didn't own slaves, so why do I have to pay for reparations? Why should my tax money go to Black people if I'm not the person who owned slaves and it was my ancestors? Because Black people are still, to this day, trying to build wealth from what happened since slavery. So that's about all of my time, but thank you so much for having me, and let's try to dismantle this system so that we can have some true equity so that all men can actually be created equal. Thank you.
Thank you, Raven. And we're going to have 3 speakers on Juneteenth speak. So we'll just go through all the speakers, and then at the end we'll have panel questions. So our next speaker is Victor Marsh, who recently got his PhD. Congratulations. He completed his doctorate in organizational behavior at the University of Colorado in May 2021. Prior to pursuing his doctoral study, he was a US diplomat posted in Cyprus, Hong Kong, Macau, and the Secretary of State's headquarter team. After working inside the US federal government bureaucracy, Vic is now an institutional scholar who studies where bureaucracies come from, organizational design decisions specifically. Vic is interested in the role of social movements and moral pressures on decisions that organizational leaders make when designing organizational policies, procedures, and practices. So I'll let Vic speak about diversity in the workplace.
Hi, thanks, and great to be back at our Sunnyvale Democrats Club. I'm pleased to see you all, and really excited about this topic. Initially, when Linda invited me, I said, "What do I know about Juneteenth? I'm not even a Texan, you know, like I've got no special thing to offer." But as I thought about it more, I started to think about a bigger question, which is how is it that a social movement, someone who is seeking to advocate for something, how is it that they ever achieve a law? So our first thinking about how do we get a Juneteenth holiday? How did this happen so recently, right? Who here remembers Schoolhouse Rock? Anybody a big fan? I was a huge fan. I still am. We're training our young child in the Schoolhouse Rock way. So we learned about the branches of government. We learned that the people writing the laws are in the legislature, that the people executing the laws and making them real in our lives are in the executive. And that when we have fights and disputes, as we so often do, this is the United States after all, and we are a diverse nation, so there will always be disputes, that the interpretation work is done by our judges. So the Schoolhouse Rock formula, it's usually as much as any practical citizen needs to know. But if you study the organizational behavior, which is the psychology group inside of business schools, that's what we are, you start to learn about some alternative processes, ways in which the Schoolhouse Rock story can be made a little more complicated. And I think we'll see that in the example of Juneteenth becoming a federal holiday also. So what does an institutional scholar at a business school do all day when I'm not teaching, right? I teach HR students, I teach business ethics, but when I'm doing my research, when I'm doing statistics, what the heck am I studying? What I'm looking at is the spread. I know this is a touchy subject, but I'm going to make an allegory to virology, folks. Okay. So I know this is a tough thing, but we're going to talk about ideas spreading around the country from firm to firm, from business to business. Ideas can spread kind of like the common cold or like some other viruses that shall not be named, right? So institutional scholars, we track these three stages of idea development. And for my studies, I study how diversity programs spread throughout the US economy. The first step is studying what we call diffusion, and that's ideas going viral. So we're studying what is it? What are the factors that make an idea get spread? We can think about Juneteenth in the same way, right? You know, this started as a Galveston, Texas thing, right? It's kind of impressive that something goes federal from the humble beginnings of one town in Texas. That's interesting, right? And institutional scholars have some predictions about how that works, right? The second thing, once we've studied how things spread, we also study how do things change or mutate? How does the idea get reinterpreted as it spreads firm to firm, state to state, economy to economy, right? So that's more where my bucket is in diversity scholarship. I'm interested in what we call tailoring. How does a firm take, you know, this spread? Oh, everyone's doing diversity training, Johnson. We've got to get on that. We've got to have a training class here, right? What does the firm do once it decides to take the popular idea and localize it and make it different? And you can think of holidays working in a similar way, right? There's going to be, if you listen to us, there's going to be some mutation. Juneteenth celebration 2030 is going to look very different than the initial celebration right now, right? What was once Texan, right, is going to be very different, right? Once it goes all across the country. And so there's going to be some friction, you know, buckle your seatbelts. There's going to be some contestation over, you know, some Texans are going to be upset once they see what Delaware does 10 years from now on Juneteenth. So that is coming. Institutional theory tells us that is definitely coming. Ideas, they spread fast, then they go through a mutation. Something is going to be locally adapted. And then the final school, which is where my intellectual grandpa, he hates it when I call it that, is Frank Dobbin. But this is my advisor's advisor, so I call him intellectual grandpa. Again, Frank will hate it if you say this, but Frank trained Androsh, who's training me now at the University of Toronto, my new gig. And he studies, okay, so an idea spread. The ideas got slightly mutated as they spread across the economy. So diversity trainings look different. Affinity groups in the workplace, right? Like I've got sort of the Black Student Union of Google or the the Hispanic Caucus of Xerox or whatever, right? So these affinity groups are something that spread like wildfire. They then once you get all that variation, you can start to measure effectiveness. So you can say, huh, the Cisco way of doing this particular program worked a little bit better or worked worse than the HP way of doing the same program. Both programs have the same title, they have the same label, right? But as an idea spreads throughout the economy, as it mutates and gets tweaked and localized in each company, then that variation, those differences, we love variation. Everything in statistics is about explaining variance, right? So that's our jam. We live for it. And so we can start to tease out, hey, what is it that matters here, right? What of all the new things people did with the same old idea, which of the new wine casks that we thought had the same old wine in it, which one is actually adding some value and accomplishing your goals? So with diversity programs, we found a big difference. We didn't know at first. At first we found, diversity training, well-intentioned, but it looks all bad, right? All the results looked terrible, right? People were losing 5% of Black women 5 years later. I'm sorry, losing 15% of Black women, fewer Black women entering managerial ranks in the firms that decided to go with a training program, right? So we tried to spread the word. No one listened to us. Everybody hates scientists some days, right? They just didn't believe it. No, we got it. And we're in the education business too, so it was super awkward, right? We believe in educating people, but this type of education is terrible for some reason. So what happens next? You keep studying, you study the variation, and people start to do different things with the training. Variation is great because then we can kind of pull apart what works and what doesn't. Turns out it was the mandatory programs that were driving all the negative effects across the economy. Mandatory diversity training. If you ever give me a soapbox, even if it's not related to Juneteenth, I'm going to say this. Don't do it, folks. It's bad. Your future numbers for Black women, Asian men, and Asian women go down. Their chance of reaching managerial rank drops by 9%, 4.5%, and 5.2% respectively, right? So it's just bad. These are average effects, so not every mandatory training. Someone once asked me, is every mandatory diversity training program, every single one bad? I said, no, this is averages, right? This is averages. This means we looked at 700 firms and the middle of the road was a decrease of that amount. But you got to imagine, usually you expect things to kind of net out to almost nothing, right? If your middle of the road company is that negative and still very significant, then it should tell us that it's very hard to do that correctly, right? It's one of those programs, right? If you're not some sort of brilliant, prodigy at diversity program writing, I would not do a mandatory course, right? Very different results when you looked at voluntary. Voluntary has a slightly positive impact on the workforce over time for those underrepresented groups that we care about expanding their networks, expanding their representation, and helping all Americans rise up to the height of their skill level, right? And not be artificially suppressed because of some social, problems inside of the workplace. So think about this as an institutional scholar who studies how ideas go viral, how they mutate, and then tries to measure the effectiveness of different types of this. I come to the Juneteenth story with a little bit of a different take than Schoolhouse Rock, right? What we've learned is that a lot of our laws, right, which we imagine as being made on Capitol Hill, a lot of our laws that are related to diversity actually have a step before legislation and before courts see those laws, right? And it's the laboratory of America's workplaces matters a lot. This is where a lot of law ends up getting based on. So imagine you're a judge. A judge hears a claim for discrimination, and someone says, you know what, this workplace is not doing everything it can to prevent discrimination. Now, the judge is probably a lawyer. And the judge, who is probably a lawyer, probably didn't also do a PhD in diversity studies, organizational behavior, right? So what do you have to go on? If you're a generalist, if you're a judge, you're trying to do what's fair, what do I do? This person says this company didn't do enough. Judges in the United States historically have asked one question. Well, what are all the other companies doing? That signal gets encoded into judicial case law. So sometimes companies are copying and pasting the ideas about diversity from companies that are famous, that just happen to be around, but who might themselves be failing at diversity. So, because a judge, again, well-intentioned, people have the best of intentions, but they haven't gotten their PhD in diversity program effectiveness. So someone like me usually shows up and tries to say, hey, Your Honor, actually, the way you stop sexual harassment isn't with a mandatory class. It's actually, weird as it sounds, with a voluntary bystander intervention class to managers. What you don't want to do, what gets you a bunch of dangerous eye rolling, where like men start gathering together at the water cooler talking about how the ladies can't take a joke, right? That's what happens when you send all the people to mandatory all employee training. So, but it's hard. If you're a judge, you don't know that, right? Nobody taught you that. Turns out you need to train the managers to keep their head on a swivel and to intervene, and that's how you end sexual harassment. Strange, strange, but true. So let's think about the Juneteenth story, right? Something starts in Galveston, the idea starts spreading. It'll get localized. Things will look different. A Texan is going to get offended, folks. It's going to happen. I guarantee you, because variation will start to look like someone's, taking liberties with our Texan Galvestonian tradition. And then at the end of the day, you see when I think the workplace story, actually, I think a workplace story driven importantly by famous technology companies probably matters here. Because what we've seen in the past few years is that a lot of workplaces, high status workplaces, which matter in the US economy, famous workplaces matter a lot for what our Congress decides to do. If famous workplaces start giving employees the day off for Juneteenth, then you start to see some copycat behavior, and we can trace this one day when we get the data. You start to see some copycat behavior from our legislative institutions too, right? Congress has to get ideas from some place. And I just want everyone here who is connected to a workplace to know that sometimes things that you're toying with, ideas that you have while you're taking your coffee break at the office, could become ideas that get encoded into laws in our legislature, because ideas have to come from somewhere, and they could get encoded into case law in our judiciaries. That's how important workplace discussions are for an open society like the United States has. Ideas have to come from somewhere. If they start to get popular in American workplaces, they can end up enshrined permanently in some places. Unfortunately, for those of us who study diversity studies, oftentimes it's the worst possible idea that ends up getting encoded. So again, if anyone knows any judges, feel free to pass them my card. I'm always happy to chat. And we can hopefully try to infuse these things with some science. But what is popular matters a great deal. And so we predict my reading, this is my take on the history of how Juneteenth became a holiday. I bet one day we'll be able to show that the workplace movement here mattered quite a bit. So stay tuned for that future history, which I don't know who's writing it. It might be me. I don't know. We'll stay tuned and see what the post-dissertation projects will be.
Okay, thank you, Victor. So we'll come back to you after we hear from our last speaker for Juneteenth. Our last speaker will be Tiffany Laundrie. She is curious and creative. She's a parent volunteer. She enjoys photography, watercolor, learning about American history, and enjoys sharing and discussing things she learns every day. Since moving her family to the Bay Area in 2015, Tiffany has been an active volunteer in her son's school and a local parent-teacher association. So why don't we let Tiffany speak?
Hi. Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me today. I appreciate the opportunity to share the insights I have about the history of slavery related to school curriculum. I was part of a team who wrote a California State Parent-Teacher Association resolution called Teaching Hard History, American Slavery in K-12 Education. And that resolution was voted on and adopted at PTA convention last month. So very briefly, the research backing the resolution illuminated the following. Understanding slavery is central to understanding the American story. But high school seniors and adults struggle to answer basic questions about enslavement. Many teachers are serious about teaching slavery, but they face challenges. Popular textbooks do not comprehensively cover slavery nor enslaved peoples, and state curriculum frameworks do not set very high expectations. The PTA resolution addresses these problems through the lens of strengthening the resources that teachers rely on. So PTA cannot write curriculum, and PTA does not decide what is taught in schools. But PTA can bring our voice to the places those decisions are made. And this resolution helps us do that. So the resolution has several calls to action that are related to supporting teachers. So those calls to action ask for PTA to advocate for better teacher training related to teaching about enslavement, to ask for better coverage of slavery and enslaved peoples in textbooks, and for instituting higher expectations in the state curriculum frameworks that are published by the State Board of Education. And so those frameworks are reviewed every 8 years. And so the history framework is expected to be relooked at in 2023. And then there's another part of the resolution that calls for PTA to educate our own membership about this history and the importance of teaching it. And that's what I'm going to be working on locally. And the idea that I have is to work with our local PTA units to see if we can partner with our public libraries to prominently display books about the history of slavery, especially ones that cover a new scholarship that's being published. I hope to be able to put together some reading and discussion groups and bring speakers to our PTA members or to the library. So I'm just beginning on that work right now, locally. And California State PTA can do similar programs at our yearly convention. And if I have success locally, I can take that to our next convention and present a blueprint that other PTAs across the state can follow. Another thing that the resolution does is it gives our PTA legislation teams a stronger basis for supporting or opposing bills that might be introduced in the state legislature. So for example, if a bill was introduced that would direct the State Board of Education to draft guidelines that could help school districts evaluate the coverage of slavery and enslaved people in their textbooks, then PTA might examine that bill, and in the light of this resolution, they might decide to support that bill. One last thing that the resolution does is it calls the California State PTA to prepare a similar resolution to take to national PTA. And depending on how that was written, and if it's adopted, that resolution in the future could give all PTAs in the nation a stronger authority to oppose the kind of bills that have been introduced recently in states that could have a chilling effect on our teachers. So I think this resolution and any future versions of it are very timely. Overall, the resolution sets the stage for further learning, further conversations, and further advocacy. And I'm confident that as PTAs keep this issue at front of mind, our members will find lots of creative ways to support our schools and teachers for teaching this important history. And I invite you, all of you, to become PTA members if you aren't already. You can join a PTA at your local neighborhood school, but there are also some special PTAs that aren't connected to schools. So locally, we have one called the Santa Clara Valley PTA, and then there's a state one called Golden State PTA. And if you do join a PTA, make sure it has the name PTA, because there are also PTOs or home and school clubs, and those are independent from the PTA organization. So I want to change tracks a little bit here. As I've worked on this project and I've shared it with people, I came to understand that it was the history that I was learning along the way that really positioned me to understand why knowing this history is important. So I want to give you something like a tiny history lesson to help you know what it means when people say we need to understand this history better. So I'm going to have you think back to the year 1773 and imagine a slave trading ship. This is a real ship called the Adventure, and it sailed out of Newport, Rhode Island. So this is not a southern city, but a northern city. And the ship was owned by two financiers in Newport, Rhode Island, and they would make about a 5% return on their investment in less than a year by the time that this ship called the Adventure would return to Newport. And let's consider what was on that vessel when it set sail. So it had a captain, and it had officers, and it had 12 sailors. And it was loaded with locally produced goods. It had been outfitted with handcuffs and shackles. It carried pork and beef, flour, and other foods. And importantly, it set sail with over 24,000 gallons of rum. So rum is the actual currency that would purchase the captives in Africa. Now, if you think of the picture that's being built here, we can already see that this slave ship did not simply move captives from point A to point B, but that it supported the livelihoods of many people: bankers, sailors, blacksmiths, farmers, rum makers, and more. In other words, the slave ship sits at the center of a complex economy. And many of those people participating in this economy might not themselves have enslaved other people, but the slave trade was at the center of that web. And new markets actually sprung into existence because of the way slavery organized society. So let's think about that rum that was being made in the Rhode Island distilleries. The molasses to make the rum would have come from sugarcane plantations in the West Indies, which was planted, harvested, and processed by enslaved labor. Now, sugar was so profitable that it was processed 24 hours a day, and that meant candlelight was needed all through the night to do the work. And sugar was so profitable in the West Indies that they didn't grow food there. They only grew sugarcane, and they had to import all their food, as well as all those candles that they need. And that means that farmers and candle makers in the American colonies could make a living producing exports for those markets that supported enslavement in the West Indies. So this is what it means to say that slavery was central to the American economy. It's not only about the number of enslaved people or the number of people who were enslavers, but how slavery was woven into society and into the economy in sometimes surprising ways. And this kind of knowledge is very different from what I learned about slavery in school, and it might be different from what you learned as well. So I hope it gives you a really concrete example of the kinds of curriculum changes that teachers and historians are hoping to make as we move forward. So I want to thank you for listening, and I want to thank you for making time in your day to consider this important history. And I'm happy to answer any questions in our question time, and I'll pass it back to our host now.
Okay, thanks so much, Tiffany. So anyone who has a question, why don't you raise your hand? So lower your hands from the other stuff and raise your hands if you have a questions for any of the panelists. So I see a raised hand from Honorable Jim Davis. Did you have a question? No, not question. Okay, anyone have questions? Okay, how about Mike Steroni?
Hi, this is really kind of a question for all three speakers. Juneteenth is a brand new holiday. What do you suggest as how it should be celebrated, or maybe it shouldn't be celebrated, like Memorial Day is more of a commemoration than a celebration? How do you suggest, and this is an opportunity for creativity since it's brand new, what are your ideas for how this should be celebrated now?
So I just went to a Juneteenth celebration that was in East Palo Alto, and it was like a cookout. Everyone was there. There were poets and rappers and dance teams that performed. They gave away a grand prize for a scholarship. They played music. People did like the electric slide and cha-cha slide and stuff. And it was a big party celebration. And I would love to see more of that. Exactly, Bruce. I would love to see more celebrations of freedom. So I would love to see Juneteenth just be a celebration that finally, everyone was freed. I mean, things still haven't been made right, but we took one giant step in the right direction. And I think that in itself is definitely worth celebrating, just as a party. Just have fun.
Okay, Victor?
Oh, cool. Yeah, this is neat. My one scholarly prediction is that this is going to be contested, right? But my bet, though, is that it's going to be less like my late granddad on Memorial Day. Like, he was very sharp about, you don't thank me for my service on Memorial Day, right? Memorial is for those who died. Veterans, talk to me in November to thank me for my service. And don't, sully the name with a mattress sale, right? So that's Alvin Marsh, right? It's like, do not buy a mattress on Memorial Day. Like, that was a big no-no for a very strict, military to the bones granddad. Oh, sorry. Sorry, you all. I'm getting used to these new earphones. Sorry. So it's going to be contested, but I think it's going to be less of a Memorial Day type problem where people really have, I think this one is more obviously celebratory. So I think the mood probably won't be contested because pretty much everyone is pro-freedom. Everyone's anti-enslavement, and no one's going to argue that, that it is like a slave Memorial Day or a slave decoration day for gravestones that many people can't even find, right? So, I mean, I just think it's going to be probably on mood less controversial that side, and then people will debate. And I really think Texans are going to have a tough time over the next few years. My wife's best friend is a Texan, and she has some very strict, they've got a parade. This is how you do it. This is how Juneteenth is done, right? I mean, I think the rest of the country is going to be pretty relaxed about that. I think as long as the mood is jubilant and pro-freedom, people are going to be for it. Yeah, I think one fun direction for this is, what do we think is going to be obscured, right? Because we already, all of our holidays cause confusion. That's just what happens when you make something special. It's always going to leak. Something's going to get confused. So what's going to be confused? We have the confusion between Memorial and Veterans Day. That's just so frequent at this point. We might as well just let it slide. We've also got the confusion. I mean, kids could be forgiven for thinking that the Constitution was signed in 1776, right? On July 4th, right? Kids know it was actually, there was some hemming and hawing, and the Rhode Island delegation left. And so around 1787, we got our act together. But I mean, having the 4th of July and having that, sing-songy 1776, it's like 70, it's like got all this alliteration. We got all these S's. And so I think we forget, like, who remembers when the Constitution was signed, right? Something is going to get obscured. And you can either be a stickler about that, and you could be, if you're the civics teacher, I think you're allowed to be a stickler and to teach the children when America got its Constitution, right? Like that first date was us giving the middle finger to the United Kingdom. That's a different day than when we finally decided how we were going to govern ourselves and got organized and separated the powers and all that stuff. But if you're not a civics teacher, you might relax a bit. Who knows? Yeah. So Juneteenth, right? The Delawareans and the Tennesseans will say, no, see, we were slave states, but inside the Union, right? Because we were patriots to the Union. And so Abe Lincoln, always the pragmatist, he said, okay, we're going to free all the slaves in the enemy camp first. We're going to free all the slaves, but if we're going to phase this policy in, and you're Abe Lincoln and you're trying to win a war, right? I mean, look, a lot of people could criticize Abe in the rearview mirror, but let's be very frank, he had a war to win. So he said, we'll make very sure to give incentive for slaves to join us in the enemy camp, in the rebellion, in active rebellion. We'll cut Tennessee a little bit of a time slack until we get our amendment through the Congress, right? So I think it's going to be natural, right? Juneteenth is going to obscure that. People are going to get angry about it, especially our social studies teachers in elementary, middle, and high school. Like, just buckle up, be nice to your social studies teachers. They're going to be in for some rough times because this is going to obscure that too. That's what holidays do.
Okay, thanks, Victor. So Tiffany, you want to answer that question?
Yeah, so what came to my mind was a podcast that I've been listening to called Seizing Freedom. And this is a podcast that focuses on the Civil War and then the time immediately after it. And it pulls heavily from the words of enslaved people and formerly enslaved people. And on the website, it says, ending slavery in America required so much more than official declarations and battlefield victories. Freedom gets built up over time. And so I would like to see or suggest, an emphasis that it's not just about a proclamation or a particular battle, but this is something we're all doing together to make sure we keep and that we make our own freedom and it's not just kind of handed to us. So that's my idea.
Okay, and we have one last question from Francis. Do you have a question, Francis?
Well, it's kind of a question in the form of a point. I grew up in California. In school I was taught about slavery, and I would be personally all for reparations. I would vote for it because of slavery, but I never learned about Tulsa in school. I didn't know. I'm quite older. And I never heard about Tulsa. I never heard about this, I'm sorry, I don't remember the name, but the Central Park thing. I recently heard a few years ago about the redlining that was written into by FDR. I mean, all of that adds up to reparations, all of that. And that's something we don't learn in school. I mean, there is so much, I imagine, that it can't be taught in grades K through 12. Otherwise, nothing else would be taught. But I think that all of that should be taught as well, and that we I don't want to diminish slavery because that's a buzzword. Everybody knows that, and the slavery reparations together. So why aren't we saying reparations for everything that came after as well? Do you see what I mean? So that's my question.
Totally. Yeah. No, I feel that so much. I've often advocated, like, what if we started with present day and worked our way back to last year and then the year before and then the year before that, right? Like, why don't we start with who got their rights violated last year, right? And then keep going back as far as we can, year by year by year. Like, let's keep cleaning, like, let's take on maybe the past 5 years, the 10 years. This is interesting. I was raised in Detroit, Michigan by two Southern families, right? So one, my mom's side from Bogalusa, Louisiana, basically Mississippi. I mean, they're barely Louisiana. And then the other side is my dad's parents from Tulsa, both grandparents. And even for them, they actually just had relatives directly impacted by the massacre in Tulsa. So that's where the knowledge came from. Tulsa public schools actually were silent on it. So can you imagine like learning from like HBO, something if you're like a citizen of Tulsa? I mean, that must be pretty freaky. And so that one seems more tractable. It seems like you can trace down property owners a little bit easier from the Black business section of Tulsa. Working your way from today on backwards, you could probably certify a class, even in some conservative federal judicial districts. You could probably certify a class a little bit quicker and easier than you can with going all the way back to your deepest descendants. Probably just faster, right? Because it'll be easier to prove things like, hey, I got a deed from when, my mom's pharmacy that got torched, right? So I do wonder about that, Francis. That often comes to my mind. I wonder if we ought to start with, okay, it's 2021. Wait, whose rights got violated in 2020 and whose rights got violated in 2019? And take it that way to certify the classes. But again, it does bump up against some structural problems, right? The federal courts around Chicago, and this is Chicago, right, where the federal government's redlining was very well documented, right? You have federal governments keep memos. I used to be a Fed. We kept memoranda, right? So they would say, yeah, here's the line. We're gonna keep the blacks over here. I mean, like this is federal memoranda. It's very well documented. And the federal courts over there for some violations of people's housing rights in the 1940s and 50s decided not to certify them as a class. They said, you're not really a legal grouping of people who have been harmed, right? And so we worry about activism. Folks talk a lot at least on certain news programs about activist liberal judges. And I think you have to be pretty darn activist to say that a group of people in a specific city with all those memoranda from the federal government going back to FDR with maps and pages that tell people where they can live, or at least where they can get a home loan, which impacts, of course, where people can live. Right. I think if you can't certify a class for housing related issues from the 40s and 50s, then you really can't have hope that you'll have reparations for enslavement of a whole population of humans. Like, how do you get there? So yeah, I think we should start with the tractable, and I think we should demand that people stop these sort of very partisan judicial readings that, oh, that doesn't count as a group for our legal purposes. Chicago, not even all Black people, they're like, look, these are Chicagoan specific people. Here's all the memoranda from the feds hurting people's economic futures. And then it's related to property, like physical land, which is like you can have historical valuation tables and stuff. That one should have been a slam dunk. But some courts don't like to do right. What can you say?
Yeah, I was going to make a comment, I think kind of similar along those lines. I think the way that we understand property rights and individual property rights, it locks in a lot of our thinking. Like I was in a discussion recently that talked about a city that they did do reparations, but they couldn't do anything because somebody was killed, but they could do something because somebody's house was burnt down. I think it really, one thing I learned recently was the idea of the open range. The open range was that if somebody owned property, but they weren't developing it and they didn't fence it, the public had a property right to go on that land and hunt and fish and forage for food. And after the Civil War, emancipated people could go on the open range and feed their families. And so what started happening was laws were rewritten, property rights were reinterpreted to close that open range so that people could not access it. And this would force people into low wage work or into sharecropping. So I think when we think about reparations, my intuition is that property rights and how they have changed over time is important to understand, and that it would help us to go back and see how property rights used to be interpreted, and that might open up our idea of how we might interpret them today.
Okay, and then last, we'll just end off with Raven. We'll end the session.
No pressure. Lots of great feedback to follow behind, so I will try my best here. But Francis, I think that you made a really great point. And that is why, if any of you are friends with me on Facebook or Twitter, I've been talking a lot about critical race theory, because this is the type of stuff that will be taught in critical race theory. And of course, this isn't something, I mean, you can't really teach about how brutal and kind of unfair the system is to Black people to kindergartners, but you can teach it at an appropriate, in an appropriate way for each age. But yeah, it is important that we learn about all the things that happen in history to Black people in order to really understand what the problem is. A lot of people, a lot of, you know, white people or just non-Black people in general, they see people yelling in the street saying Black Lives Matter. They see people saying the police is racist. They see people saying, you know, I'm being discriminated against at work and all this other stuff. And they're like, what? What do you mean? I have no problem with the police. I just called them yesterday and they were fine. What are you talking about? I've never seen someone get discriminated against work. What do you mean? I even have people who tell me, I didn't see you experience any racism when you ran for city council. What? Here in California? In the Bay Area, you mean to tell me there's racism still today? Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Alyssa, yes. I have many stories for anyone who has time and wants to hear them. But it is very important for us to talk about the issues that we have with the police, that Black people have with the police, the issues that Black people have with trying to get loans from banks, the issues that Black people have when we're just trying to get health care, the issues that Black people have when we're trying to survive and walk down the street and go on a jog and cuddle with our significant other and watch TV, all the things that people have done, 12, 13-year-olds playing in the park. It's like Black people don't get to do those things freely because all those, not forgetting to turn on your blinker when you're making a turn and getting pulled over by the police. Like, these are things that Black people have to consciously think about all the time to risk getting stopped and frisked, getting unfairly arrested, or just overall harassed by law enforcement. And then there are people who we share our stories and they say, well, what did you do? And I'm sure that a lot of women who are on the call can relate when I say that. What did you do? What did you do to cause this? What were you wearing? Were you looking suspicious? And I think that is why it's very important for us to have conversations like this. And unfortunately, you all who are here are not the target audience for us to have these discussions with, because you are the people who want to learn. I don't want to talk to you. I want to talk to your neighbors, your friends, your aunts and uncles, the people who you probably stopped talking to during the pandemic because you were like, I can't with you. The Republicans, anyone who's in my comment section arguing with me about critical race theory. Those are the people that I want to talk to, not you guys, because you guys actually see the problem. Like Francis said, I've never learned this. Exactly. Do you all know that after the Tulsa race massacre, no one was arrested? Everything went on. Like, I know that we talk about that wasn't taught in the school books, but that wasn't talked about in Tulsa after it happened. It was like, yeah, they killed all these Black people. It's fine. Moving on, back to regularly scheduled programming. And that has been consistently the history with Black people in the United States. Black people historically, since we've gotten here, have been slain in the streets and no one is held accountable. And that still happens today. And that is why I need you all to vouch for critical race theory to be taught. That is why I need you all to tell your friends about Seneca Village. I need you to tell your friends about the MOVE bombing. The problem with this fight against trying to dismantle this system is that there are not enough people talking about the system in order for everyone to know the problem. I'm sure if everyone knew that Black people had a hard time getting home loans, some kind of fuss would be made. If everyone knew that there were all of these issues, I mean, like I've seen so many allies marching in the streets with me saying Black Lives Matter, and they're like, I had no idea that this has been happening this whole time. And I'm like, let me tell you about what happened to me when I was in high school. So that I'll stop it there. But yeah, there's a lot of things that aren't being taught, that aren't in our history books, and that is because the system has designed it that way. Because if you don't know the history, if you don't know the problem, then what are you fighting against? What do you have to fight for? So that's what I'll end it. Thank you, Linda.
Okay, thank you to all our speakers. Really great talk and all these ideas. We actually, Sunnyvale Democratic Club, we have a diversity committee. So anyone who wants to join it, just reach out to me, Linda Sell, and join it or advise us on how we can, in our club, have more diversity and how we can be championing more diversity within our government and the Democratic Party. Anyway, so we'll move on. And I did want to say that we had a little short session on acknowledging Pride Month, but that's because in August, we're going to have a longer session about San Jose Pride. So we'll get back to honoring Pride in August with a long session, but we wanted to commemorate Juneteenth today. Okay, so next we'll move on to Margaret. Thank you to all our speakers. Next, we'll move on to Margaret Okazumi, who Margaret is a member of the Santa Clara County Democratic Party Central Committee. She is known for her activism in progressive causes, receiving several awards over the years, including the 2014 Madge Overhouse Volunteer of the Year by Santa Clara County Democratic Party, and has served in numerous nonprofit boards and government commissions. So she'll be speaking about state redistricting, how you can get involved, and the county redistricting. So we'll highlight Margaret. Margaret, are you able to speak? Hi, Margaret. Are you here? I know you're here, but are you able to unmute? Can anyone see if Margaret's making hand signals or anything?
She's making hand signals, but she's muted.
Oh, so you're making hand signals. We can move on to Martin if you're still trying to get unmuted, Margaret.
Yeah, she's muted through Zoom.
Okay. So why don't we just do Martin first and then Margaret. Oh, Margaret, are you unmuted? You were unmuted for a little while. Okay, why don't we move on to Martin? And Martin is gonna talk about state legislation that we've, our Sunnyvale Democratic Club has supported and how they're doing. So Jason, do you want to share the screen with Martin?
Here, yeah.
Oh, there's Margaret. Okay, we'll just go through with
I'm
Margaret.
sorry.
Oh, that's fine.
Sorry. Okay.
Okay, great.
So I will.
We can hear and see you.
Okay, excellent.
And
I'm
can
going
you share
to,
your screen?
yes, let me.
Okay, great.
Work on that. All right. Well, happy Juneteenth, everyone. This is part 2 of the redistricting presentation. And today I'm going to give you a quick tutorial on how to give effective input for the state and county redistricting processes. So why is this important? This once in every 10-year process. Well, this time it's particularly important because we are losing a congressional district in California. We had 53 districts, now we're going to have 52. So the lines are definitely going to change. And if you don't speak up, your community may be divided or grouped in with other communities in a way that you don't want and which could hurt how well you're represented. Right now, the Citizens District Commission is actually meeting and taking public input right now. They are focusing on certain zones or regions at different the meetings, but you can actually comment at any meeting that you like. And I'm just gonna quickly share so you can see, here's a live video stream. Oh, they just adjourned, but they were conducting the meeting. And you can see that you can call in, there's a phone number, and you can get on the list to speak. And then they also strongly encourage that you go and use their drawing tool to submit input. So to get started, you would, if you need an account, you would sign up here and sign up for an account. Okay, so you can draw and submit maps using the online community of interest tool as shown. What are communities of interest? So there are a variety of ways. A community of interest is like basically anything, any case that you can make that would be plausible in terms of what you think a community grouping would be. And hold on here. Okay. And so there's many ways to define a community of interest. So it could be, where do people tend to hang out? So do Sunnyvale residents tend to hang out more in Mountain View or Saratoga, for example? Where do people go to work? Where they, are there school boundaries in common? Major transportation corridors or interactions? And so we know that the congressional districts will change. So now is a chance for you, the time for you to weigh in to say, does Sunnyvale have a greater affinity with Cupertino or Mountain View or Palo Alto compared to, say, Saratoga or Monte Sereno and Los Gatos and so forth? Okay, and then before I go into the don'ts, whoops, okay. And the commission actually just sent out an email talking about what to talk about when you give your input. And so it's like, what brings you together? What are your shared interests? What's important to your community? Are there nearby areas you want to be in district with, nearby areas that you don't want to be in a district with? Why or why not? Has your community come together to advocate for important services, better roads, schools, or health centers in your neighborhood? You can also mention things like watersheds, ecological boundaries, or assets that features that your community has in common with the neighboring communities that you want to be grouped with. So I listened to the approximately 4.5, 5 hours of testimony from the first community input meeting, and I have some tips for folks for how to be effective. Now, that first meeting, you have people who are very politically minded, and it's clear that like pretty much everybody who commented has some ulterior motive for commenting. Now, this particular commission does seem to be a bit less political than the last one, but by and large, it's a pretty sharp group of commissioners. And particularly the last group, they could totally see through what people's motives were. And a lot of times people presenting testimony would telegraph them. So please don't refer to where incumbents live or signal electoral or partisan motivations. They are not supposed to consider those at all, and they will largely not look kindly on that, okay? Don't in your testimony say, oh, I live in CD 17, blah, 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 or I'm in CD 21 and AD whatever and SD whatever, because how many of you have memorized the boundaries for Assembly District 48? Anybody? Right, so that's actually in Los Angeles. How about Congressional District 51? So if you refer to district numbers like that in the testimony, yeah, they're not going to know what you're talking about. So don't do that. Especially because those numbers are going to be changing. The boundaries will be changing and the numbers may be changing. So don't refer to those, but do talk about cities, counties, specific major street names that the demographer can look at, that they can find on a map, and that will help to orient them, like specific landmarks, monuments, those kinds of things that everybody can understand and sort of mentally relate to. And don't say negative things about another community, please, when you're giving your testimony. Okay, and don't complain about how your city redistricting got totally screwed up or your county redistricting, unless it like directly relates to how they drew the lines for the state. But the city redistricting and county redistricting is done by a completely separate group of people and they have no control over it. So complaining about that is like just wasting their time. So don't do that, and vice versa. If you're testifying to the county, do not complain about the state lines. It's not helpful. And now is the time to give input. Now, this month, next month. Don't wait until after the first draft, because once they've done their first draft, they're just going to be tweaking it slightly. They're not going to be making major changes. So now is the time to weigh in. Okay, do tell a story or a narrative that is descriptive, memorable, and paints contrasts. All right, you want it to stay in their head, and absolutely emphasize community interest and always tie it in how it matters for your political representation in a nonpartisan way. The only time that you should be talking about politics, for example, there was very effective testimony by folks from a group that is concerned about noise from the Burbank airport. And they specifically talked about how in the last redistricting, the Burbank airport was carved out and put into a neighboring district represented by Adam Schiff, and their congressperson Brad Sherman was like much more concerned representing the airports, the residents who were impacted by the airport and their plans for expansion, whereas Adam Schiff was like supported by the airport boosters. And so the airport people sent a letter to the commission saying, please keep the lines the way they are. And then they got up and said, we're not well represented, that the airport actually needs to be in our district because it directly impacts us. And, you know, this like the person who represents the airport like needs to be selected by us. So that, you know, that's an example where you can bring politics in, but it's because you're relating it to a specific community concern that's nonpartisan, right? This affects everyone. So do emphasize that kind of thing. And if you do have quantitative data, you can provide links to that in your written testimony. It's good to back it up. This time around is different from the last time because we don't have the census data yet. Last time we had the census data, people were able to go and use Maptitude or like different maps with the actual data and draw districts with actual numbers in them and suggest them to the commission. This time we can only speculate how the census data is going to come out. Like we have some idea, but we're not exactly sure. And the congressional districts have to be drawn to within population 1 person. So the congressional districts in particular are very tricky to draw. With the state legislative districts, they have more leeway where if they're within plus or minus, I forget if it's like 5% or something, they're good. Practice your presentation, maximum 3 minutes allotted. Yeah, and give your input earlier in the process rather than later, and organize others to do likewise. Now, switching gears to the county level redistricting. Bear in mind that county level redistricting is not independent. So even though it's semi-independent, where you're going to have 5 out of the 15 commissioners drawn at random, so to speak, out of whatever pool, small group of people applied for this. So it's much harder to influence this process. Most of the commissioners will definitely be coming into this with a political agenda, but do your best. And which commissioners do you personally know? So I just found out that Nancy Smith got appointed to the commission by Supervisor Otto Lee. So she's going to be one of the commissioners. So if you have thoughts on the county lines, you all know Nancy, you all know how to reach her. So yeah, call her up, bend her ear. She'll be one of those commissioners. And if you do want the lines to be drawn more impartially, fairly, push for a truly independent commission to be created for next time, 10 years from now. Okay, and this is the approximate timeline for the county process. The Board of Supervisors is appointing their first 10 commissioners. So Nancy is going to be confirmed on Tuesday. Then in July, the commission, those 10 commissioners will meet. They will select the remaining 5 commissioners. They can begin taking public input, I guess sometime, well, they might kind of wait till August, really, you know, when the full commission is convened. And they'll get together, start to direct the line drawing. Now, note that the census was delayed, and so this whole timeline may be delayed by a few months. But just from what I know about past redistricting processes, what I would anticipate is that they start actually discussing and giving the demographers some guidance, directing them on the line drawing in August and September, and that they would actually finish a draft by early October. Then they would take input to like tweak the lines. Then in November, the Board of Supervisors takes a look, comments, tweaks the lines, and then they would finally approve it on December 7th. But because the census was delayed, it sounds like that might be pushed, like all this might be shifted by a month or so, where they would approve the lines in January. I'm not exactly sure, but definitely the big holdup is that we don't actually have census data yet. That's kind of important. And I also just heard that the state redistricting process, that they may not finalize their lines until 2023. If that's true, yeah, then our districts won't actually change until 2023 or 2024. So that'll be maybe 2024. So that'll be rather late. So we'll just see, but it does take a lot of time to draft assembly, state, and congressional districts. A lot of lines to draw. And so that those are my tips for redistricting. I hope that you will all participate and comment, especially if you're concerned about the county supervisorial district representation. Joe Simidian will be termed out, I believe, in 2020. Is it 2022, I guess 2024. And so, yeah, there are definitely pros and cons to Sunnyvale being divided. If we had a bunch of people in Sunnyvale who aspired to run for county supervisor, then we could potentially have 2 county supervisors from Sunnyvale. But if you prefer that Sunnyvale be more unified, you can speak out for that. So do we have time for questions, or how do you want to handle this, Linda? Okay, Linda, you're muted.
We're running behind schedule. So I was
Okay.
wondering if it's okay with everyone, if you have questions for Margaret, put it in the chat, and we'll move on to the next session. And
Great.
also, if anyone has questions, you can ask me too. And so thank you so much, Margaret, for answering questions. And then since Nancy is going to be one of the commissioners along the way, we're going to have frequent updates of what's going on from. It's going to be like a series for our club. Okay, thank you so much, Margaret. Okay, now we'll move on to Martin Pine, who is our political director for Sunnyvale Democratic Club. And he's been following legislation that our club has supported, environmental legislation. So why don't you take it from there, Martin? And if you have questions, please ask Margaret on the chat.
Okay, so we have, is this sharing the giant thing that says update on bills?
Yeah, we see it. Thanks, Martin.
Okay, cool. So I'm going to be super fast because we're running low on time. So feel free to jump in and ask me if I'm speaking too much Sacramento-ese. Okay, so this is just a rundown of the bills that we voted to support at previous meetings, and the deadline for bills to get out of their house of origination was the end of May. So I figure this would be a good time to circle back and see on how those bills are doing. So in numerical order, SB 67, which was Senator Becker's clean energy, round-the-clock clean energy standard program, that's been pulled for further consultation back in April. So that's going to be a 2-year bill. SB 68, which is to make it easier for homeowners to convert their property into being electrical powered and have electric vehicle charging facilities. That passed the Senate 35-1 on May 28th. And that's scheduled to be heard in Assembly Committee, the Utilities and Energy Committee, on June 30th. So if you want to give testimony in favor to it, that would be the time. SB 345, which would have made it easier for low-income and disadvantaged communities to gain access to energy efficiency, that died in the appropriations suspense file, which is its own special process that I don't think you all want to hear me go on about today. SB 596, this would help. This is Senator Becker's concrete and cement emissions reduction bill. This passed the Senate on a party line vote. I believe it was actually 31-9. Senator Atkins added her aye vote after this screenshot was taken. That passed the Senate May 24th, and that will be heard by the Assembly Natural Resources Committee on June 23rd. SB 771 would give lower income Californians a tax break when replacing an older vehicle with a newer or used electric hybrid car. That passed the Senate on May 26th, but it's being held in the Assembly for further consultations with stakeholders. That's also going to be a 2-year bill. That passed 34-4. There's a handful of Republicans. You can see some of the more moderate Republicans voted for it, and some of the more hardliner Republicans voted no. And then we also voted to support AB 1091, which was Assemblymember Berman's bill about the VTA, and that's also being held for further discussions. That became a 2-year bill back in May. So I know I went really fast there. So if anyone has any questions about any of that, I can't actually see chat in this UI, so let me know.
Okay, and then also next month in July, we're going to have a special whole meeting, a larger session talking about state legislation on environmental bills, and SB 350 will come and speak.
Yeah, there are
So-
obviously a lot more bills of interest. Those are just the ones we as a club have voted to support.
Yeah, thank you, Martin, for following that. If you have questions, you can ask Martin in chat. So did Marie want to make an announcement about the eviction moratorium, or? Okay. Well, if Marie wants to do that, we can do that after Mike Storoni speaks. So we'll let Mike Storoni.
On a question of privilege, can we stop recording at this point? I don't think we need internal club.
Okay.